A quiet night turns into a nightmare when flames burst from Ethan's barn, throwing wild shadows across the dark fields as he stands frozen, watching everything he worked for fall into burning ruin. But even as the fire roars louder and the smoke climbs higher into the sky, something else begins to glow inside his small cabin, a silent reminder of a past he tried to forget, an old buffalo rifle resting in the corner, heavy with history and heavier with justice, and while his eyes fill with tears from loss and smoke, his heartbeat shifts from shock to a steady, cold rhythm, because he suddenly understands this fire wasn't an accident. It was a message, a challenge sent by the men who thought he would break. Yet as the flames paint the night in gold and red, the rifle waits dawn, and Ethan knows that the same sunrise that ends this fire may also start his revenge. Ethan lives on the far edge of the wild frontier, where the wind moves through the tall grass like a slow river, and the sunrise always falls gently across his small wooden ranch. And every morning he steps outside with quiet pride, feeding his horses, checking the fences, and touching the warm noses of the cattle that trust him more than anyone else, because this land is the only family he has left, a place shaped by his sweat, his footsteps, and his father's lessons. And each day follows the same peaceful rhythm: coffee at dawn, work under the wide sky, and calm evenings by the barn as the world settles into silence. But beneath that calm, something feels different, a thin tension in the air he cannot explain, like the land itself is holding its breath. And even though Ethan doesn't know why, a quiet warning stirs in his chest, hinting that this peace is about to shatter. Ethan paused at the edge of his porch as that uneasy feeling inside him stretched tighter, and while the last light of evening sank behind the hills, he sensed a strange stillness settling over the land, as if the wind itself had stepped back to watch what would happen next. But he shook it off and walked toward the barn to close the doors for the night, unaware that shadows were already moving far beyond the tree line, silent figures slipping between the dark pines with a purpose that carried danger in every step. And as Ethan brushed dust from his hands and turned toward the path leading back to the house, a faint sound reached him, something too soft to be normal yet too sharp to ignore, causing his breath to hitch for a moment while he listened. But the noise vanished, leaving only unsettling quiet. So he forced himself to continue walking, even though every instinct whispered that something was wrong. And when he finally reached his door, he hesitated before stepping inside, glancing back at the fields that usually gave him comfort, but now seemed to hide secrets he could not see. And as the night deepened, he settled by the small table near the window, trying to calm the uneasy rhythm inside his chest, while the dim lantern flickered against the wooden walls. Yet the silence around him felt heavier than usual, stretching into something unnatural that made him shift in his chair, unable to rest. And when he finally stood to pour water into a cup, the horses suddenly cried out from the distance, a panicked sound he had never heard from them before, sending a jolt through him that made the cup slip from his hand and shatter across the floor. And before he could process the noise, another followed. Low, rough voices carried on the wind, voices that did not belong anywhere near his land, pulling him toward the door with a dread that tightened around his spine like ice. And as he stepped outside, the smell hit him first, sharp and terrifying, the unmistakable scent of smoke sliding through the cold air long before he saw the first flicker of orange at the far end of the field. And when that flicker grew into a violent glow, his heart crashed inside his chest, because his barn, the place that held his animals, his tools, and pieces of his father's memory, was being swallowed by flames that shot high into the dark sky, painting the land with a cruel, twisting light that made his throat close with disbelief. But before he could run, he heard laughter echoing from the shadows near the tree line, cold and mocking, turning the night into something far more sinister, and his eyes narrowed as he searched the darkness, seeing quick movements, figures slipping away before he could reach them, leaving only smoke, fire, and rising terror in their wake. And as the heat grew stronger and the barn walls began to collapse, Ethan's breath broke into ragged pulls, not from the smoke alone but from the crushing weight of seeing everything he had built fall apart in a matter of minutes. Yet even through that agony, rage surged beneath the grief, a steady, burning force that refused to let him fall, pushing him back toward the house. The fire roared louder behind him, and when he burst inside, desperate to find something, anything, that could give him strength, his eyes landed on the old buffalo rifle resting in the corner where he had left it untouched for years, a piece of his past he had never expected to use again. But now the sight of it struck him like a spark in dry grass, awakening something fierce and unbroken inside him, and he moved toward it with trembling hands that steadied the moment his fingers closed around the worn wood, feeling the weight of memory, duty, and survival all at once. And as he loaded the rifle with slow, precise motions, his jaw tightened, because he knew the men who set the fire believed the flames would break him, believed he would stand helpless as they destroyed his life. But they had misjudged him, and as he stepped back outside with the weapon heavy in his grip, the fire's glow lit his face in harsh gold, revealing not fear, but a hardened resolve that stretched through his entire body. And the moment he turned his eyes toward the dark expanse beyond the burning barn, he spotted faint footprints running deep into the open land, trails left by the very men who thought they could vanish without consequence. And he followed those tracks with slow, determined steps, leaving behind the crackling ruin of his barn as the night closed around him, yet offering him no comfort, only purpose, and each footstep across the cold earth echoed with the memory of every moment he had spent building his life from nothing, strengthening him with a clarity he had never felt before. So when the voices faded into the distance and the world fell into deep silence again, Ethan kept walking, guided by the faint marks in the dirt, by the rising fury inside him, and by the promise he silently made as flames devoured the last of his barn, a promise that before dawn broke across the frontier, those men would understand what it meant to take everything from someone who had nothing left to lose. Ethan moved through the dim frontier night with the rifle held steady in his grip, following the faint trail the intruders left behind, and as the fire's glow faded behind him, the cold darkness ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, yet he kept moving with a determination shaped by every hardship he had ever survived, and the silence around him deepened into a heavy cloak that pressed against his thoughts, urging him forward even as the weight of loss threatened to slow his steps. But he pushed through, studying the disturbed soil beneath the thin moonlight until the footprints curved across a rocky patch where the wind carried the faint scent of smoke mixed with sweat and leather, a sign that the men who had destroyed his barn were still close enough for him to sense their presence. And his pulse sharpened as he tightened his grasp on the rifle, feeling the familiar weight settle his nerves, while memories of his father's voice rose in the back of his mind, steady words about patience and focus that guided him now as clearly as they had years ago. And with each step he moved more quietly, placing his boots with deliberate care while watching the landscape with an intensity he had not felt since the last time danger touched his land. And when he reached a stretch of uneven ground where the tracks shifted toward a cluster of tall brush, he slowed his pace, crouching low to examine the bent blades of grass that revealed a group passing through in haste. And that small detail tightened something inside him, because the men clearly believed they would reach safety before anyone dared follow, but they had not counted on Ethan's resolve, nor on the quiet storm building inside him, and as he continued forward, the distant shape of an abandoned cabin emerged against the faint outline of early dawn far on the horizon, its presence stirring old memories of travelers who once camped there before the frontier grew dangerous. And he paused for a moment, listening to the wind push against the broken boards and cracked walls, waiting for any sound that didn't belong to the night. And just as he steadied his breath, he caught a faint clatter echoing from inside the cabin, a noise too sharp to be created by the breeze, making him lower his body as he moved toward a cluster of rocks that gave him enough cover to observe without being seen. And through the crooked doorway he spotted shadows shifting with careless confidence, the kind of confidence that belonged to men who thought they had escaped all consequences, and the sight filled him with a quiet fury that strengthened his spirit rather than clouding it, giving him absolute clarity as he steadied his breath and analyzed every movement inside the ruin. And he noticed 3 distinct figures, each speaking in low tones that carried hints of pride and satisfaction, tones that reminded him of the cruel laughter he had heard near the burning barn, and the memory hit him with a force that nearly unbalanced him. Yet he kept his grip steady, resting the rifle against his shoulder as he studied the scene with careful focus. And the longer he watched, the more details revealed themselves, the way one man limped slightly, the way another gestured with restless impatience, and the way the third leaned against the wall with a smug ease that made Ethan's jaw clench. But even as anger grew within him, he refused to move too quickly, knowing patience could save his life. So he forced himself to breathe with slow control while observing every gap, every opening, every weak point he could use when the time came. And as he waited, the men shifted again, dragging a crate from the corner and dropping it with a thud that sent dust swirling through the broken interior. And when one of them cursed at the weight, Ethan realized they had brought stolen goods with them, confirming that the fire had been part of a larger scheme rather than a random act, deepening the sting inside his chest as he understood just how little value they placed on the lives and labor of others. But even though the anger pressed harder against his ribs, he held himself still, knowing the right moment had not arrived yet. And while the sky above him slowly lightened toward the first hint of dawn, he felt the world around him shift, as if the land itself understood what he was preparing to do. And he inched closer with precise movements that made no sound, sliding behind a fallen tree trunk that gave him a clear line of sight into the cabin, and the cool wood against his arm calmed him just enough for him to steady his aim. But he did not raise the rifle yet, not until he understood the layout fully. So he continued to observe with unwavering focus until he was certain of every detail. And once certainty settled within him, he exhaled slowly, letting the tension drain from his shoulders while his mind sharpened into a state of calm intensity. And the early morning breeze brushed against his face with a chill that reminded him why he had followed this trail, why he had refused to surrender to despair when the fire consumed his barn, and why he stood here now with the rising sun casting pale light across the frontier, because he knew this moment was not about a weapon or revenge alone, but about standing against the men who believed they could take from him without consequence. And as the wind shifted again, carrying the faint sounds of the men laughing inside the cabin, Ethan tightened his grip with final resolve, ready to step from the shadows into the dawning light and face the danger waiting ahead. Ethan steadied his breath as the soft glow of early dawn brushed across the broken cabin walls, and the laughter drifting from inside sharpened something deep within him, urging him to move with absolute precision as he stepped from behind the fallen tree and crossed the chilled ground with slow, controlled movements that made no sound beneath his boots. And with each step he felt the world narrow into a single line, a quiet path that led him closer to the danger waiting just beyond the crooked doorway. Yet he did not rush, keeping the rifle low as he studied the flicker of motion through the gaps in the weathered boards, knowing that one wrong move could turn the moment against him. And when he reached the edge of the cabin's shadow, he paused, leaning his shoulder gently against the rough wall while listening to the men argue over the stolen crate they had hauled with them, their careless voices rising and falling in patterns that revealed their exhaustion, their arrogance, and their complete belief that no one would dare follow them this far, a belief that tightened Ethan's jaw as he shifted his stance and adjusted his grip, feeling the old rifle settle against his arm like a silent companion ready for whatever came next. Yet he still waited, letting his breathing grow steady while the thin wind carried faint dust across the open land behind him, and his eyes traced the gaps in the boards again, noticing a small window at the back where one of the men leaned lazily, glancing outside without suspicion, unaware that Ethan now stood only a few paces away with the rising sun spreading pale gold across his face. And in that fragile, quiet moment Ethan felt a wave of unexpected emotion sweep through him, not fear or anger alone, but a powerful sense of responsibility, a weight that reminded him of every lesson his father had taught him, lessons about strength, patience, and the difference between justice and cruelty, and he understood that what he was about to do needed to be controlled, measured, and free from rage. Because the moment he let anger lead, the cost would be far heavier than anything already taken from him. So he inhaled deeply, feeling the cool air settle inside his chest before he stepped toward the doorway with calm, silent steps that carried the kind of stillness a man found only when he had lost everything except the will to stand. And as he reached the entrance, the men remained unaware, still talking, still laughing, still believing they were alone, until Ethan's shadow stretched across the floorboards and one of them paused mid-sentence, turning with a puzzled look that froze instantly when he understood someone else was there, and before the man could shout or reach for his weapon, Ethan lifted the rifle with smooth precision and aimed it without trembling, his voice low and steady as he ordered them to stay still. And the sudden silence inside the cabin grew so heavy it felt like the entire frontier held its breath. But the man nearest the crate moved slightly, a nervous twitch that made the wooden floor creak beneath his boot, and Ethan's eyes hardened as he repeated his warning in a tone that carried no threat, only certainty, a tone that told them clearly he was not here to bargain or plead. And the men froze, their expressions shifting from surprise to frustration as the reality of the situation settled over them. Yet Ethan kept his stance strong, never lowering the rifle as he stepped farther into the cabin, circling them slowly with measured movements that showed he was prepared for any sudden action, and the tension inside the cramped space coiled tighter with every heartbeat until one of the bandits, the one who had leaned near the window, spoke with a forced calm, trying to test Ethan's resolve with taunts that suggested he was alone, outnumbered, and acting on emotion rather than reason. But the words slid off Ethan like dust on stone, because he had no interest in their excuses or threats, and instead he focused on their hands, their posture, and the small details that revealed intention long before action arrived. Details his father had taught him to recognize during long nights of quiet training, and suddenly the man near the crate shifted again, a subtle move too deliberate to ignore, causing Ethan's voice to cut through the tense air with sharp authority as he stepped forward and pressed the rifle more firmly into aim, making it clear that any attempt to provoke him would end the moment instantly. And the man stiffened, realization spreading across his face as he lifted his hands slowly, finally understanding that Ethan's calm was not weakness, but something far more dangerous, a resolve built from loss that carried no room for hesitation. Yet even as control settled firmly in his favor, Ethan felt something else, a strange ache deep inside his chest, a reminder that he never wanted this moment, never asked for confrontation or danger, and only stood here because the men before him had pushed him past the point where silence was possible. And as the sunlight strengthened, pouring through the broken roof in thin beams that cut across the dust-filled air, Ethan tightened his grip one last time, his breath leveling into a steady rhythm as he prepared to bring this standoff to its breaking point, ready for the next move that would decide everything. Ethan held his stance with unwavering focus as the first strong beam of morning light crossed the cabin floor and touched the dust drifting between him and the men, and the sudden brightness revealed every tension in their faces, every twitch lifting beneath their skin as they searched for any opening that might give them a chance to strike back. But he stayed perfectly steady, reading their movements the way he had read tracks across the land since he was young, knowing that fear often pushed men to make reckless choices, and the longer the silence stretched, the more he felt the moment tighten like a wire pulled to its limit. Yet he refused to rush, letting each heartbeat guide him as he shifted slightly to keep all three in his line of sight. And just as the man nearest the crate stepped back with raised hands, trying to look harmless, the one beside him narrowed his eyes with a hint of defiance, a look that reminded Ethan of the kind of men who caused pain simply because they believed no one dared stop them. And that spark of arrogance made Ethan brace even harder, lowering his center of gravity as he adjusted the rifle with slow precision. But before he could speak, the third man near the window made a sudden move, a quick dip of his shoulder that sent adrenaline surging through Ethan's chest. Yet instead of firing, he slid 1 foot sideways and anchored himself firmly, yelling at the man to freeze in a tone that carried the steel of absolute command, a tone that cut through the tension like a blade, and the man jerked to a stop, with frustration tightening the corners of his mouth, while Ethan's sharp gaze followed every inch of his posture, searching for any sign of deception. And even though none of the men reached for their weapons, Ethan saw the restless glances flickering between them, silent signals that told him they were waiting for a moment, any moment, to break free or overwhelm him. But he stepped farther into the cabin with a deliberate slowness that revealed his control, letting the floorboards creak under his boots as he circled them at an angle that forced them into a tighter retreat. And the man with the defiant eyes finally cracked, raising his voice with forced bravado as he claimed Ethan wouldn't dare pull the trigger because he was outnumbered and alone. Yet Ethan didn't react with anger, only with a cold steadiness that made the words crumble into the dust between them, and he lifted the rifle a fraction higher with a focus so sharp it drained the last trace of confidence from the room, and the man fell quiet, swallowing hard as he realized the weight of Ethan's resolve. But tension, once ignited, rarely fades quietly, and the seconds that followed stretched painfully thin, until the man near the window shifted again, not much, just a slight turn of his wrist as his fingers brushed the edge of a hidden knife tucked beneath his jacket, and Ethan caught that movement instantly, tightening his grip with a speed born from instinct while stepping sideways to keep the other two from flanking him. But the moment the knife glinted in the faint sunlight, the air snapped, breaking the fragile stillness as Ethan raised the rifle in one fluid motion that filled the small wooden room with a sudden shock of energy. And before the man could fully draw the blade, Ethan shouted for him to drop it, his voice echoing against the broken walls with a force that made even the dust trembling in the light seem to hesitate. But instead of surrendering, the man hesitated, a dangerous flicker crossing his face, as if he believed he could move faster than the rifle's aim. And in that single pause, Ethan saw the truth the man would attack, the others would follow, and the standoff was seconds away from exploding into chaos. So Ethan acted first, firing a warning shot into the floor with perfect control, sending splinters bursting upward and freezing the room in thunderous shock as the men staggered back with eyes wide and hands raised, their brief confidence shattered as the echo rolled across the cabin and out into the brightening morning air. And Ethan used that moment, that instant of raw fear, to command them to drop every weapon they carried. And with hands now trembling, one man tossed the knife to the ground, another kicked a small pistol across the floor, and the third stepped back with clenched teeth as if surrender tasted bitter. Yet none dared defy the steady aim of the rifle now fixed on them, and as Ethan maintained his stance ready for any last attempt at violence, he noticed the men's expressions shift from defiance to desperation, a slow collapse of whatever courage they believed they had, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any fire, thicker than any smoke, pressing into the cabin as Ethan's breath settled into a controlled rhythm, realizing the moment he had chased through the night had finally arrived, the moment where justice stood face to face with those who believed the frontier belonged only to the cruel. And as the first full light of dawn slid across the floor, Ethan prepared to deliver the reckoning that had been waiting since the barn first caught fire. Ethan kept the rifle trained on the men as the echo of the warning shot faded into the stretching silence of dawn, and the dust drifting through the beams of sunlight seemed to freeze in midair, while the cabin held its breath. Yet he did not step back or loosen his stance, instead grounding his boots firmly as he ordered them to move toward the center of the room where the floor was clear, and no hidden weapon could be reached without him seeing it. And the three obeyed with stiff, uneasy movements, glancing at one another with a mixture of panic and frustration, as if searching for a final plan that no longer existed. But Ethan watched every motion with sharp concentration, reading the tension in their shoulders and the restless flicker in their hands, and not once did he allow his focus to drift, because he understood that moments like this turned dangerous the instant a man believed he could outrun consequences. So he commanded them to kneel, his voice steady but edged with a calm authority that left no doubt he would not be swayed. And after a long hesitation they lowered themselves slowly, the rough boards creaking beneath their weight, while Ethan stepped forward with deliberate precision until he stood just far enough to maintain control, but close enough to intercept any sudden movement. And the sting of smoke drifting from his burned barn still clung to his clothes, filling his chest with a heaviness that mixed grief with resolve as he stared at the men who had set his life on fire without a second thought. Yet even now, with the rifle steady and the dawn brightening around him, he felt no desire for cruelty, only the need for justice, something anchored deep in him from years of hard lessons taught by loss and silence. And as he studied their faces that showed no sign of regret, only fear sparked by being caught, he tightened his grip slightly, reminding himself that the moment demanded clarity, not emotion, so he exhaled slowly before ordering them to remove the small sacks tied to their belts and slide them across the floor. And when they did, the soft scrape of leather against wood echoed like a confession, revealing coins, tools, and small valuables clearly taken from other places long before they reached his land. Proof of the trail of damage left behind by the same carelessness that destroyed his barn. But Ethan kept his expression unchanged, guiding them with firm commands as he pushed the sacks aside with his boot and shifted the rifle to ensure none of them tried to rush toward the doorway. And the air grew heavier again as the minutes stretched, each one marked by the steady rhythm of his breath and the tremble building in theirs, until the man with the defiant eyes finally cracked under the weight of silence and muttered excuses about desperation and survival. his voice thin and uneven as he tried to twist the story into something that painted them as victims of circumstance rather than men who had chosen the path they walked. But Ethan didn't interrupt or argue, letting the man speak until his words collapsed into the stillness without changing a single truth. And when the excuses stopped, the man near the window began pleading in a trembling whisper, promising they would leave the frontier forever if Ethan let them go, swearing they meant no harm beyond what was already done. Yet the desperation in their voices only sharpened the ache inside Ethan's chest, because he knew these promises were built on fear, not remorse, and men who lied so easily would do so again. The moment danger passed, so he cut through their pleas with a single command that made them fall silent, telling them to place their hands behind their heads and remain completely still until he said otherwise, and the firmness in his tone allowed no argument, no bargain, no escape. And as they obeyed with shaking limbs, he took one careful step back, keeping them in sight while shifting his weight to free his left hand enough to reach for the coil of rope hanging beside the doorway, a tool he had noticed earlier when he first slipped into the cabin's shadow, and lifting it with controlled movements, he returned his full focus to the kneeling men, ordering the one closest to the wall to rise slowly and walk toward him without shifting his hands, and the man staggered to his feet with fear tightening each step as Ethan guided him to the post near the cabin entrance, tying his wrists securely with practiced knots his father once taught him to use when securing restless horses. And when the first man was bound and left with no way to interfere, Ethan moved to the second, tying him with the same cold precision, and finally the third, ensuring each knot held firm against struggle or trickery. And once the last rope tightened into place, the entire cabin seemed to exhale, the danger that had hovered so close slipping away with the soft rustle of wind entering through the broken boards. And Ethan stepped back, lowering the rifle just enough to ease the tension in his arms without losing readiness, his breath finally loosening as he realized the moment he had been preparing for through the long night had arrived. And the weight of what came next settled heavily in his chest as he looked at the men bound before him, knowing justice was no longer a question of survival but of truth. And the morning light, now brighter and clearer, filled the cabin with a quiet clarity that made Ethan understand that this confrontation, this long path from fire to dawn, had never been about revenge alone, but about standing for everything he refused to let the frontier take from him. Ethan stepped out of the cabin as the sun finally cleared the horizon, its warm light washing over the land that had survived the night with him. And for the first time since the fire began, he allowed himself to breathe without the weight of danger pressing against his chest. Yet when he looked back at the bound men inside, he felt no triumph, only the quiet strength of a man who refused to fall even when everything around him burned. And as the morning wind carried the last traces of smoke from his ruined barn, he made a silent promise to rebuild with the same steady hands that had protected his land, knowing the frontier could take many things but never his resolve. And while he walked toward his ranch with the rifle resting against his shoulder, the world felt changed, shaped by loss, yet guided by courage, and the dawn behind him glowed brighter than ever, marking the beginning of a life reforged in fire and reclaimed with unwavering heart.